This is the story of one of the most difficult and enduring struggles of our time. From the quiet villages of the late Ottoman era to the refugee camps of the 20th century, from moments of hope like the Oslo Handshake to the wars and humanitarian crises that continue today, we will travel through the Israeli-Palestinian story as it unfolded across generations. It is a history of families and faiths, of sorrow and resilience, of borders drawn and redrawn, and of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. Welcome, dear listener, to History to Relax. I'm glad you are here tonight. If you enjoy these long, gentle histories, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from. Every message helps this community grow and keeps these stories alive. Now, find a comfortable spot, let your shoulders drop, take a deep breath, and allow yourself to drift. The story is about to begin. Part 1. The Land Before the Storm. The night is quiet over a land that has seen countless dawns. Long before the headlines, before the marches and the borders, before the bitter arguments of modern times, there was simply a stretch of hills, valleys, and coastal plains along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. In the late 19th century, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, a world both ancient and changing. If you could have walked there then, you might have started on the coast, where the sea rolled in with a soft hiss and the air smelled faintly of salt and tar from fishing boats. Towns like Jaffa bustled with life. Narrow streets wound between stone houses. Markets spilled into the open air. There were oranges piled high in wicker baskets, copper coffee pots gleaming in the morning sun, and merchants calling out in Arabic, Hebrew, Ladino, Armenian, and Greek. Sailors came and went. Pilgrims arrived by boat to begin their journeys inland. Travel a little east and you would enter a land of olive groves and gentle hills. Stone terraces climbed up slopes where families had farmed for centuries. Donkeys clopped slowly along dirt paths, carrying sacks of wheat or baskets of figs. The rhythm of life was agricultural and seasonal. Rain in winter, planting in spring, long dry summers, harvest in the fall. Villages were close-knit, made up of extended families whose roots stretched back generations. Further inland, the city of Jerusalem stood as it had for thousands of years, sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Its walls enclosed neighborhoods divided by faith and tradition, but connected by trade and shared streets. Jewish families prayed at the Western Wall. Christian pilgrims walked the Via Dolorosa. Muslim worshippers filled the courtyards of the Haram al-Sharif. Bells, chants, and the call to prayer marked the hours. Life was deeply spiritual and yet practical. Shopkeepers sold candles and bread. Tailors worked their needles by lamplight. The Ottoman administration was present but not always close. Taxes were collected, officials posted in towns, soldiers patrolled roads when needed. For most villagers and townspeople, the empire was a distant power in Istanbul. Local notables, often from respected families, handled day-to-day issues. Arabic was the language of the countryside, while Turkish and a variety of other tongues appeared in official settings. In some towns, Ladino, a Judeo-Spanish dialect, echoed among long-established Sephardi Jewish communities. Greek Orthodox and Armenian churches anchored their faithful. Diversity was woven quietly into the land. It was not a place without tensions. Farmers worried about land rights. Clan rivalries could spark disputes. Taxes felt heavy, and the Ottoman Empire itself was weakening, struggling to keep control as European powers eyed its territories. But overall, life moved slowly, rooted in tradition. In the 1880s and 1890s, a new current began to flow in. It started far away, in European cities where Jews faced persecution, pogroms, and legal barriers. Some Jewish thinkers, writers, and activists began to speak of a return to the ancestral land of Israel, a political movement that became known as Zionism. For many Jews suffering discrimination in Russia and Eastern Europe, the idea of resettling in Ottoman Palestine was both spiritual and practical, a place to live freely and rebuild a national home. Small groups of Jewish immigrants, many from Eastern Europe, began arriving. They purchased land, often through middlemen, and set up new agricultural settlements. These early pioneers lived in rough conditions, draining swamps, planting vineyards, and trying to create self-sufficient farming communities. Some local Arab farmers worked alongside them, others worried as land ownership patterns changed. In some cases, land was bought from absentee landlords in Beirut or Damascus, which meant local tenants might be displaced, a slow, quiet source of resentment. At the same time, Arab intellectual life in the cities was awakening. Newspapers and schools spread new ideas about identity, reform, and independence. Local leaders, teachers, and writers started to think about what it meant to be Arab, to belong to this land, to have a future beyond Ottoman rule. They saw the empire struggling, felt European influence growing, and now noticed these new immigrants with unfamiliar customs and a strong sense of collective purpose. In rural villages, life went on, but news traveled by word of mouth and through letters. A teacher might return from Beirut with talk of politics. A merchant might bring stories of Europe and change. The seeds of future struggle were being sown quietly, not yet as open conflict, but as unease, a feeling that the world beyond the fields and markets was shifting. Daily existence remained slow and textured. Imagine a dawn in Galilee, the air cool and scented with dew, roosters calling, shepherds guiding flocks out to graze. Women carried water in clay jars, children ran barefoot along stone paths. In Jerusalem, a baker kneaded dough as pilgrims passed his doorway. In Jaffa, fishermen hauled in their nets before the sun grew hot. In the hills, farmers stopped work briefly to pray. The land felt ancient, layered with memory. The late Ottoman government tried small reforms, land registration, new railways, modest legal changes, but power and wealth were unevenly distributed. Many peasants were poor, paying rent or tax to distant owners. Some Jews arriving from Europe also struggled, facing malaria, debt, and the challenges of an unfamiliar climate. Communities were separate, but not yet enemies. They traded, shared wells, sometimes worked side by side. Yet identities were becoming sharper. Jews spoke of return and renewal, Arabs of heritage and belonging. By the turn of the 20th century, the land was still quiet compared to the storms ahead. But beneath the olive trees and stone domes, history was stirring. A weakening empire, rising nationalism, and the long shadows of European anti-Semitism were converging here. People were building lives, raising children, and tending fields, unaware that the decades to come would transform everything. The story of this place, later called Israel and Palestine, would become one of migration, loss, resilience, and longing. But in these final Ottoman decades, it was still a mosaic of villages and holy sites, of merchants and farmers, of prayers in many tongues echoing under the same wide sky. Part 2. New Ideas, Old Roots. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still stretched across much of the Middle East, but its power was fading. Reforms arrived in waves that often failed to touch the lives of ordinary people. In Palestine, days still moved with the rhythm of the seasons. Families planted, harvested, and prayed as they had for generations. Yet the world was beginning to move faster. Steamships crossed seas with ease, railways pushed into new territories, and newspapers carried ideas farther than ever before. In Europe, Jewish communities lived with a fragile balance of acceptance and exclusion. Some families thrived in cities rich with culture, while others faced segregation and deep hostility. In the Russian Empire, the 1880s brought pogroms, violent attacks that destroyed homes and lives, leaving entire neighborhoods in fear. Many Jews fled westward to safer countries. Others looked toward a land tied to ancient prayer and longing. The hope of return was not new, but began to take a political form. Writers and activists like Theodor Herzl called for a Jewish homeland, a place where Jews could live with safety and dignity. This idea, known as Zionism, was born from centuries of yearning and the harsh realities of modern Europe. Small groups began to act. Young pioneers, many from Russia and Eastern Europe, left behind familiar cities to build a new life in Ottoman Palestine. They came with little money but fierce determination. These early waves, known as the First Aliyah, arrived in the 1880s and 1890s. They bought land often through middlemen, sometimes from absentee landlords living in Beirut or Damascus. On this land, they tried to build farming communities where Hebrew would be spoken as a living language and where Jews could work their own soil. They drained swamps, planted orchards, and built simple houses. Disease and poverty tested them. Many struggled with malaria and with the unfamiliar climate. Support from wealthy Jews abroad, especially Baron Edmund de Rothschild, kept some settlements alive when hope alone might not have been enough. For the Arab families already living on this land, the changes were at first modest but noticeable. Outsiders were not new. Merchants, pilgrims, and foreign Christians had long come and gone. But the new Jewish arrivals were different. They came with an organized purpose and tended to build communities that worked mainly within their own circles. Some Arab farmers were hired to help in the fields. Others lost access to land when new owners took control. In many cases, peasants who had rented and tilled the same fields for generations found themselves displaced when deeds changed hands under Ottoman legal reforms. Such losses were not always loud or public, but they stirred unease. In the cities, educated Arab elites began to talk about what these changes meant. New Arabic newspapers published essays about land and heritage. Teachers and lawyers debated what would happen if immigration continued to grow. The weakening of the Ottoman Empire added to their concern. European powers were expanding their reach, and some local leaders feared the land might slip from Arab and Muslim hands altogether. At the same time, reformers dreamed of a cultural awakening, a renewed Arab identity that could stand strong in the modern world. Yet, day-to-day life did not feel like a battlefield. In many markets, Jewish and Arab merchants traded side by side. Children sometimes played together without asking where families had come from. Arabic-speaking Jews were woven into city life, and Arabic remained the dominant language of the countryside. But quietly, identities were sharpening. Jews dreamed of a national revival. Arabs worried about losing land and culture. The land itself remained deeply spiritual and diverse. Pilgrims arrived each year in Jerusalem, walking narrow stone streets to holy sites. Jewish families prayed at the Western Wall and longed for redemption. Christian pilgrims followed the Stations of the Cross. Muslim worshippers filled the courtyards of Al-Aqsa, their prayers rising with the scent of olive oil lamps. In Jaffa, oranges glowed in the sun, and fishermen hauled in their catch while merchant ships unloaded goods from Europe. The rhythms of prayer and work continued, even as change gathered beyond the horizon. The Ottoman rulers tried to modernize where they could. New railways and telegraph lines appeared, and laws about land registration and immigration were updated. But the empire was overstretched and often corrupt. Local officials might enforce restrictions one day and ignore them the next. European consuls protected foreign investors. Poor farmers without written deeds could lose everything if a distant landowner sold property. Jewish immigrants sometimes faced bureaucratic hurdles, but often found ways to stay, supported by foreign networks and funds. By the early years of the 20th century, the Jewish population was still small compared to the Arab majority, but signs of permanence were clear. Hebrew schools opened. Street signs appeared in the revived language. Agricultural collectives strengthened. Arab writers warned that immigration might one day reshape the land. Jewish leaders spoke of creating a self-sufficient modern homeland. Both sides carried their own memories and fears, one of centuries of exile and danger, the other of losing the land and culture they felt were theirs. And yet, if you stood among the olive groves or walked through a bustling souk at that time, the future would still seem unwritten. Life was filled with simple human routines, children laughing, merchants bargaining, pilgrims singing hymns or reciting prayers, farmers tending to vines and wheat. The land felt eternal, but the ideas forming in distant capitals and local newspapers would change it forever. Nationalism, migration, and the slow decline of empire were converging, quietly shaping the path ahead. Part 3. The British arrive. The early years of the 20th century brought storms that swept far beyond the fields and markets of Palestine. The Ottoman Empire, stretched thin across many provinces, was pulled into the First World War. For the people of this land, the war brought hardship, hunger, and uncertainty. Fields went untilled as young men were conscripted into Ottoman armies. Taxes and requisitions drained villages of grain and livestock. Locust swarms in 1915 devoured crops and deepened the misery. Families prayed for rain, for bread, for peace. The war also brought new powers into play. Britain and France, eager to carve up the crumbling Ottoman territories, made promises and secret agreements. In London, diplomats spoke of protecting holy sites and maintaining order. To Arab leaders, Britain hinted at independence if they rose against Ottoman rule. To Zionist leaders, Britain suggested sympathy for a Jewish homeland. These overlapping promises would plant confusion that never truly left. In 1917, as the war raged, a short statement of only a few sentences changed everything. It came to be known as the Balfour Declaration. In it, the British government declared support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that nothing should prejudice the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. For Zionists, it was a triumph. An international power had recognized their dream. For Arabs in Palestine, it was bewildering and troubling. They were the majority population, yet their name was not even mentioned in the declaration. Many wondered what this meant for their homes and fields. At the same time, British forces were advancing across the region. General Allenby marched into Jerusalem in December 1917, choosing to enter the Old City on foot as a gesture of respect. Ottoman rule, present for centuries, was gone. The British now held the keys to the land. When the war ended in 1918, Palestine, along with Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, was no longer Ottoman. The League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Palestine, a kind of legal cover for colonial control. Officially, Britain was to prepare the land for self-rule. In practice, it managed the territory with its own interests in mind. The arrival of British administration changed the rhythm of life. English became a new language of bureaucracy. British police patrolled streets, and officials in khaki uniforms managed offices in Jerusalem. New roads and railways were laid out. Modern schools opened under British supervision. But beneath these signs of order, mistrust grew. For Jewish immigrants, the mandate was a chance to expand. Immigration increased, supported by Zionist organizations abroad and by Britain's declared support. New villages, farms, and urban neighborhoods appeared. Hebrew grew stronger as a spoken language. Tel Aviv, founded just before the war, began to blossom into a modern city. For Arab Palestinians, the mandate brought a rising fear of being displaced. Newspapers and public meetings voiced concerns that Britain favored the Zionist project at their expense. The memory of Balfour's words lingered. Local leaders petitioned, wrote letters, and organized protests, insisting that they were the people of the land with deep roots and rights that should not be ignored. The British tried to balance, issuing white papers that sometimes limited immigration, sometimes encouraged compromise, but rarely satisfied either side. Each decision seemed to deepen suspicion rather than ease it. Daily life carried on amid this new uncertainty. In Jerusalem, bazaars still rang with the calls of merchants selling spices and cloth. In Jaffa, the orange groves spread wider, their fruit exported in growing numbers. In villages across Galilee and the coastal plains, Arab farmers sowed and reaped, while new Jewish settlers plowed fields and drained swamps in nearby lands. Side by side, yet increasingly apart, two communities were building futures they imagined very differently. At weddings, at funerals, at religious festivals, people clung to their traditions, drawing strength from them as the political ground shifted beneath their feet. The British Mandate years were years of transition. Empire had changed hands, but the land itself remained what it had always been. Hills lined with olive trees, valleys golden with grain, and cities alive with prayer and trade. What had changed was the promise of competing futures. To Jews fleeing persecution, Palestine seemed a fragile but real chance at safety and revival. To Arabs, it was their ancestral home, threatened by a foreign-backed movement they did not fully understand but already feared. Britain, holding the reins, found itself caught between these rising claims. The calm routines of planting, fishing, and worship continued, but in the background, larger forces had taken hold. Nationalism, once only an idea in distant capitals, had arrived in the villages and markets. The quiet land of olive groves and stone streets was now part of a global story, one that would shape not just borders, but the lives of everyone who called it home. Part 4. The Mandate Years. The British Mandate in Palestine began with promises and ended with deep divisions. In the 1920s and 1930s, the land found itself pulled in two directions at once. One community sought to turn ancient longing into modern statehood. The other sought to hold on to its homeland and way of life in the face of rapid change. The British, who had promised something to both sides, stood uneasily between them. For ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, children walking to school, these years were lived in markets, villages, and growing cities. But just beneath the surface, tension grew with every passing season. When the British first took control after the Great War, they were greeted with curiosity. Their soldiers marched in pressed uniforms. Their administrators brought order to taxation, roads, and policing. In Jerusalem, government offices filled with British clerks, files stacked high, typewriters clicking through the day. For many Arab villagers, the Ottomans had been the only rulers they had known, often distant and heavy-handed. The British felt different at first, modern, efficient, and, at least in the early years, less burdensome. But they had also brought with them the Balfour Declaration, a document that gave Jews around the world a new claim to this land. For Jewish immigrants, the declaration was a green light to arrive in growing numbers. For Arabs, it was a warning that their land might be slipping away. The 1920s opened with waves of new arrivals. From Europe, especially from Russia and Poland, Jews fled persecution and poverty. Many came young, idealistic, eager to build farms and cities in Palestine. They brought with them socialist ideas and organized themselves into collectives called kibbutzim, where all labor and goods were shared. Others founded moshavim, cooperative villages where families farmed individually but supported each other. In Tel Aviv, a small neighborhood established before the war began to spread across the dunes north of Jaffa. Whitewashed houses lined new streets, cafes and schools opened, Hebrew signs appeared, and a modern city took shape. Zionist institutions such as the Jewish Agency, the Histadrut Labor Federation, and the Haganah Defense Organization grew stronger, laying the foundation for a society within a society. For Arab Palestinians, these changes felt unsettling. They remained the majority population, living in villages scattered across the countryside and in towns like Nablus, Hebron, and Acre. They worked in citrus groves, tended olive trees, sold goods in markets, prayed in mosques and churches, and sent their children to schools that were slowly expanding under British rule. Yet they could see Jewish immigration growing steadily, financed by wealthy benefactors abroad and supported by British administrators who seemed sympathetic to Zionist aims. Land sales created particular pain. In many cases, large landowners living in Beirut or Damascus sold estates to Zionist organizations. The tenant farmers who had worked those fields for generations often had no legal protection and were forced to leave. Families who once plowed the same soil as their ancestors found themselves without land or livelihood, fueling resentment and fear. The first open clashes between the communities began in 1920 and 1921. In Jerusalem, during religious festivals, riots broke out between Arabs and Jews, leaving deaths and destruction in their wake. British police struggled to control the crowds. Arabs, hearing speeches that warned of dispossession, attacked Jewish neighborhoods. Jews, feeling threatened, organized militias and began to defend their communities more forcefully. Each riot deepened mistrust. Afterward, commissions of inquiry tried to assign blame, but their reports satisfied no one. For Arabs, the presence of Jewish immigrants felt like a threat to their majority and their identity. For Jews, the violence confirmed the need for self-defense and the urgency of building a secure homeland. Daily life continued amid these upheavals. In the villages of Galilee, peasants rose at dawn to guide their plows through the fields, their hands rough from work but steady in tradition. In Tel Aviv, families walked the seaside promenade on Saturday afternoons, enjoying music and ice cream as Hebrew songs played from radios. In Jaffa, orange groves stretched in neat rows, their fruit crated for export to Europe. The sweet scent of blossoms filled the spring air, even as political arguments grew sharper in coffee houses and town squares. Life was full of ordinary rhythms, yet anxiety lingered just beyond sight. The 1920s saw further waves of Jewish immigration, each shaped by events abroad. The Bolshevik Revolution drove some from Russia. In Poland, anti-Semitism deepened, pushing more families toward Palestine. With each arrival, Jewish neighborhoods expanded. Hebrew schools multiplied, teachers instructing children in a language that had only recently returned to daily speech. The revival of Hebrew created a cultural unity that gave the newcomers confidence and pride. They published newspapers, built theaters, and sang new songs of return and resilience. To many, it felt as though an ancient dream was becoming real. Arabs, too, found their voices in new ways. Newspapers in Arabic criticized the British and warned of Zionist expansion. Public meetings in Nablus, Hebron, and Jerusalem drew crowds who demanded that Britain halt immigration and protect Arab rights. Leaders petitioned London, insisting that they, not newcomers, were the rightful inhabitants of the land. Yet divisions weakened Arab politics. Families and clans competed for influence. Some notables sought compromise with the British, while others called for resistance. Peasants and laborers often felt distant from the speeches of city leaders, concerned more with survival than with politics. Still, a sense of common cause was slowly growing, shaped by fear of being displaced. In 1929, tension erupted violently in what became known as the Western Wall disturbances. Disputes over access to the wall, sacred to Jews, spiraled into rumors and anger. Arab crowds attacked Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safed. The violence was severe. In Hebron, dozens of Jewish residents, many from families that had lived there for centuries, were killed. Survivors fled, ending a Jewish presence in the city that had lasted hundreds of years. For Jews, the massacre was a shocking reminder of vulnerability. For Arabs, the unrest was seen as resistance to encroachment. The British responded with force, and again, commissions of inquiry were held. They acknowledged Arab fears of land and displacement, but also confirmed Jewish rights to immigration under the mandate. Neither side was satisfied. The wounds of 1929 hardened attitudes on both sides, leaving scars that never fully healed. The 1930s brought even greater changes. The rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi persecution in Germany sent desperate Jewish refugees seeking safety. Many turned to Palestine, the one place they believed offered hope. Ships carried families across the Mediterranean, some legal, others clandestine. Entire neighborhoods of Tel Aviv filled with German-speaking Jews, their cafes and shops adding to the city's cosmopolitan feel. Wealthy professionals and skilled workers brought new energy, but also increased Arab concerns. Each new arrival deepened the sense among Arabs that they were being overwhelmed. In 1936, years of tension erupted into a broad Arab revolt. It began with strikes. Merchants closed shops, farmers refused to sell produce, and workers left jobs. The strike soon turned into an uprising, with attacks on Jewish settlements, ambushes of British patrols, and sabotage of railways. Villages became centers of resistance, while British troops marched through the hills in heavy columns, trying to restore order. The revolt lasted for 3 years, marked by bloodshed, curfews, and punishments. For Arabs, it was an assertion of dignity and desperation, a cry against displacement and foreign control. For Jews, it was another reminder that their security could not rely on British promises, but on their own defenses. For the British, it was an exhausting conflict that drained resources and exposed the impossibility of pleasing both sides. The British response was mixed. On one hand, they cracked down on Arab fighters, arresting leaders, demolishing homes, and imposing collective punishments. On the other, they recognized the depth of Arab anger. In 1939, as the Second World War loomed, Britain issued a white paper that limited Jewish immigration severely, promising independence for an Arab-majority Palestine within a decade. For Arabs, this seemed like a partial victory, though many doubted British sincerity. For Jews, it was a devastating betrayal, coming just as European Jews faced the horrors of the Holocaust. Ship after ship of refugees was turned away, some sent back to Europe to meet tragic fates. The gap between Jewish hopes and British policy grew wider than ever. Through all these struggles, the ordinary details of life continued. In Arab villages, weddings were celebrated with drums and dances, the bride's hands painted with henna, families feasting late into the night. In Jewish kibbutzim, young men and women worked shoulder to shoulder in the fields, singing folk songs in Hebrew as they harvested wheat under the blazing sun. In British offices, Clerks stamped documents and issued permits, their typewriters echoing down stone corridors. On Fridays, the markets of Jerusalem filled with color, baskets of pomegranates, bolts of fabric, trays of sweet pastries glistening with honey. Life refused to pause, even as politics grew sharper and more dangerous. By the late 1930s, Palestine was a land divided. Two communities, living side by side yet rarely together, each dreamed of a future that excluded the other. Jews envisioned a homeland rising from exile and ashes, a place of revival and safety. Arabs envisioned their ancestral land remaining in their hands, free from foreign rule and dispossession. The British, caught in the middle, found themselves distrusted by both. Every attempt at balance left one side enraged. The land was restless, no longer the quiet province it had been under the Ottomans. It had become a stage for a conflict that would shape the century. As the 1930s closed, war clouds gathered again in Europe. Palestine, though far from Berlin or Warsaw, would soon feel the shock of that coming storm. The Holocaust would change the scale of Jewish desperation. The Second World War would redraw global power. Britain's hold on the Mandate would weaken under the weight of global conflict. But in these interwar decades, the seeds of future battles were already planted. In olive groves and orange orchards, in kibbutzim and villages, in city streets and British offices, the story was unfolding. A story of hope, fear, and a struggle for belonging that would only grow more intense. Part 5. Shadows of Europe. The 1930s had left the land deeply unsettled. The Arab revolt had scarred villages and families. British rule was fragile, and Jewish immigrants had poured in despite restrictions. But nothing prepared the world, or Palestine, for the catastrophe that struck Europe in the 1940s. The Holocaust changed not only Jewish history, but the entire trajectory of the Middle East. It reshaped identities, forced urgent choices, and placed unbearable weight on a land already heavy with tension. When war broke out in 1939, Palestine once again felt the reach of distant empires. Britain, now at war with Nazi Germany, tightened control of the Mandate. Jewish and Arab leaders alike had to decide where they stood. For Arabs, the white paper of that same year, which restricted Jewish immigration to 75,000 over 5 years, seemed a partial victory. Yet many did not trust Britain to keep its word. For Jews, the white paper was a crushing blow. It came just as Jewish families across Europe were desperate to escape Hitler's rise. Doors everywhere were closing, and now Palestine, the one place seen as hope, was being locked. Despite restrictions, Jews in Palestine made choices shaped by the global war. Many joined the British Army, forming Jewish brigades that fought in North Africa and later in Europe. Others turned their energies toward building underground networks to bring refugees in against British orders. These clandestine operations became lifelines. Ships, often overcrowded and unsafe, carried Holocaust survivors across the Mediterranean. Many were intercepted by British patrols, their passengers detained in camps in Cyprus or forced back to places they had fled. For the refugees, the pain of survival was compounded by rejection. Their faces, thin and weary, carried the shadows of what they had endured: ghettos, camps, and death that defied comprehension. The Holocaust itself, though far away, cast a long shadow over Palestine. Families in Tel Aviv or Haifa received letters that never reached their destination. Whole branches of family trees disappeared in silence. Communities that had once been thriving in Poland, Hungary, and Germany were reduced to ashes. For Jews living in Palestine, this devastation gave new urgency to the dream of a homeland. It was no longer just an idea of revival, it became a matter of survival. Never again could Jews rely on the mercy of others. Never again could they wait for safe harbor elsewhere. Palestine, in their view, had to be the refuge. Arabs in Palestine watched these events with horror and complexity. They knew of the suffering in Europe, but they also saw Jewish immigration rising again, legally and illegally, bringing more settlers, more land purchases, and more pressure on their communities. The fear of losing their homeland sharpened. Many wondered why they should pay the price for crimes committed in Europe. For them, the Holocaust was a tragedy of unspeakable cruelty, but it was also something distant, and they questioned why it should mean their displacement. This gap in perception widened mistrust. Two peoples, each with wounds and fears, found it harder than ever to meet in understanding. During the war, the British clung to control. Palestine was strategic, sitting at the crossroads of the Mediterranean and the route to the Suez Canal. British troops filled barracks, airfields buzzed with activity, and military convoys rumbled through the streets. For ordinary people, rationing and shortages became common. Coffee was scarce, sugar limited, petrol rationed. Farmers sold produce to soldiers, shopkeepers learned to manage without imports, and families made do with less. The rhythms of daily life carried on, but always under the shadow of war. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world discovered the full scale of the Holocaust. Images of skeletal survivors, liberated from concentration camps, filled newspapers. Testimonies of horror reached Palestine. In Tel Aviv, people gathered to read the names of relatives who had not returned. In kibbutzim, memorial services were held for communities lost forever. The grief was vast, and it fueled a determination that the Jewish question could no longer remain unanswered. The land had to become a haven, a state, a permanent refuge where no one could be turned away. In the aftermath, immigration surged again. Tens of thousands of survivors, many with no homes to return to in Europe, set out for Palestine. They boarded ships, often organized by the Zionist underground, their journeys dangerous and uncertain. Some vessels were so overcrowded they barely floated. Families clung to hope as they crossed the sea, children wrapped in thin coats, suitcases filled with little more than photographs or prayer books. For many, the voyage ended not in the promised land, but in detention camps, fenced with barbed wire, guarded by British soldiers. The bitterness of being blocked from entry after surviving hell left lasting scars. The British, exhausted from the war and pressed by global opinion, found themselves trapped. On one side, Arab leaders demanded that immigration stop entirely, warning that their people would not accept being outnumbered or displaced. On the other side, Jews insisted that survivors had nowhere else to go and that Britain had betrayed its mandate. British soldiers patrolled ports, seized ships, and arrested underground fighters. Violence grew as Jewish militias targeted British installations, blowing up railways, attacking police stations, and in one infamous act, bombing the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946. Britain, weary and bloodied, began to look for a way out. For Arabs, the post-war years brought both opportunity and fear. Politically, they hoped Britain might finally promise independence for Palestine with an Arab majority. They pointed to the pledges made during the war to Arab leaders elsewhere and argued that they, too, deserved self-determination. But they also saw Jewish immigration rising despite restrictions, and they sensed international sympathy shifting toward the Zionist cause. The influx of Holocaust survivors felt like a tide too strong to stop. Farmers who had once worried only about harvest now watched new settlements grow nearby, their future uncertain. Daily life in these years was restless. In Jerusalem, British patrols and armored cars rolled through narrow streets. In Jaffa, Fishermen cast nets under the watchful eyes of soldiers. In Haifa, the port filled with ships, some legal, others carrying hidden passengers. In villages, Arab farmers tended olives and wheat, while Jewish pioneers dug irrigation canals and built new collective farms. At night, gunfire sometimes echoed in the hills. Rumors traveled quickly, stories of clashes, arrests, or new arrivals spreading faster than the truth. Families lived with unease, yet still celebrated weddings, welcomed babies, and gathered for holidays. Even in the shadow of history, life refused to stop. International attention now turned toward the Mandate. Britain, unable to resolve the conflict, handed the question to the newly formed United Nations. Committees were sent to study the land, to hear testimony, to weigh claims. They saw refugee camps in Europe filled with Jewish survivors who refused to return to their ruined homes. They heard Arab leaders insist that Palestine belonged to its people, not to newcomers from Europe. The UN wrestled with impossible choices. How to honor both promises. How to reconcile two claims to one land. In 1947, the United Nations put forward a plan to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. For Jews, the plan offered recognition and legitimacy, a state of their own after centuries of exile and suffering. For Arabs, it was unacceptable. They were the majority, yet the plan gave large portions of land to the Jewish state, including fertile areas and key ports. To them, it felt like injustice imposed from abroad. They rejected it, warning that it would lead to war. The months that followed were filled with violence. In cities and villages, clashes erupted between Jewish and Arab militias. Roads became dangerous, farms were attacked, convoys ambushed. Families fled neighborhoods where they were minorities, seeking safety among their own. The British, preparing to withdraw, struggled to maintain order, their soldiers caught in the crossfire of a conflict they no longer wished to manage. The land slipped toward chaos. For Jews, the memory of the Holocaust burned in every decision. They felt they could not wait, could not trust, could not risk another betrayal. They built defenses, organized underground armies, and prepared for the possibility that independence would come only through battle. For Arabs, the fear of losing their homeland deepened with each rumor of partition. Villagers held meetings. Leaders called for resistance, and fighters prepared for confrontation. The future felt like a storm approaching, inevitable and overwhelming. Yet, through all of this, ordinary life persisted in fragile ways. Children still studied in schools, learning to read and write in Hebrew and Arabic. Merchants still opened their shops at dawn, arranging goods in careful rows. Farmers still prayed for rain, their lives bound to the soil regardless of politics. Families still gathered at dusk, lighting lamps, telling stories, eating bread warm from the oven. Life pressed forward, even as history pressed harder. The Holocaust had changed everything. It had turned an already complex struggle into one charged with unbearable urgency. It had given Zionism moral force that no argument could deny, while at the same time leaving Arab Palestinians feeling unheard and abandoned. The British, unable to reconcile these forces, prepared to leave. The United Nations offered a plan, but the land was already bleeding. The stage was set for a conflict that would not end with partition, but with war, displacement, and a catastrophe that Palestinians would remember as the Nakba. As the 1940s moved toward their end, Palestine was a land of contrasts. Oranges glowed bright in orchards, children played in the streets, prayers rose from mosques, churches, and synagogues. Yet beneath the surface, fear and hope collided. Two peoples dreamed of futures that could not both be fulfilled. The shadows of Europe had reached the eastern Mediterranean, and nothing would ever be the same again. Part 6: Partition and Civil War. By 1947, the British mandate in Palestine was nearing its end. The empire that had once stretched across continents was exhausted from war and debt, and Britain no longer had the will or the resources to hold on. Its soldiers patrolled streets that no longer felt under control. Its administrators managed files and reports that brought no solutions. In London, politicians debated what to do with a land that had become a burden, caught between two peoples whose demands seemed impossible to reconcile. The decision was made to hand the problem to the newly created United Nations. The hope was that the world could solve what Britain could not. The UN Special Committee on Palestine arrived in 1947 to hear testimony, visit towns and villages, and gather evidence. They saw refugee camps in Europe still crowded with Jewish survivors who had nowhere to go. They heard Arab leaders insist that partition would mean the theft of their homeland. They walked the narrow streets of Jerusalem, where holy places stood side by side, reminding everyone how much was at stake. Their task was enormous: to find a plan that gave Jews a homeland after their suffering, while not denying Arabs their rights as the majority population. After months of work, the committee recommended partition. The land would be divided into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem and its surrounding holy places under international control. For the Jewish community in Palestine, the plan was far from perfect, but it was accepted. It promised recognition, legitimacy, and most of all, sovereignty. For a people still mourning 6 million dead, still watching ships of survivors turned away, it was enough. Jewish leaders celebrated the vote of the UN General Assembly in November 1947, where the plan was approved. Crowds danced in the streets of Tel Aviv, flags waved, tears flowed. For them, it was the birth of a dream that had been nurtured for centuries and made urgent by the Holocaust. For Arab Palestinians, the plan was a profound shock. They were the majority population, yet the map awarded large portions of the land, including fertile coastal plains and key ports, to the proposed Jewish state. Many villages and towns would be cut off from one another. Refugees were not mentioned. To Arabs, it felt like a plan imposed from abroad, one that ignored their rights and history. They rejected it outright, declaring that they would never accept the division of their homeland. Arab newspapers published defiant headlines. Leaders warned that partition would bring war. For many villagers, the details of the UN map were less important than the feeling that their future was slipping away without their consent. Almost immediately, the land descended into violence. The period between the UN vote in November 1947 and the British withdrawal in May 1948 became a civil war. Neighborhoods that had once traded in the same markets turned into battle lines. Convoys were attacked on the roads, villages raided, and urban quarters fortified with sandbags and barbed wire. Each community built defenses, not only against outsiders, but against their neighbors. In Jerusalem, the fighting was especially fierce. The city, sacred to three faiths and claimed by both peoples, became a maze of barricades and snipers. Arab and Jewish militias battled for control of neighborhoods, while British troops tried to keep order but were increasingly ignored. Food convoys to Jewish areas were ambushed, leaving shortages that led to hunger and desperation. Arab families fled Jewish-dominated quarters, while Jewish families left Arab ones. A city of mingled faiths and languages began to split apart. In the countryside, the violence took on another form. Villages that had coexisted for generations suddenly faced each other as enemies. Rumors of massacres spread fear, and in some cases, they were real. The attack on the Arab village of Deir Yassin in April 1948 by Jewish paramilitary groups left more than 100 villagers dead, men, women, and children. News of the massacre spread quickly, causing panic in surrounding villages. Families fled, often leaving behind their homes and fields with only the belongings they could carry. For Arabs, Deir Yassin became a symbol of terror, a warning of what might come. For Jews, it was defended by some as a military action against hostile forces, condemned by others as a stain on their cause. Either way, it hardened the war. Jewish convoys also suffered. The Hadassah medical convoy, carrying doctors, nurses, and patients to the Mount Scopus Hospital in Jerusalem, was ambushed by Arab fighters in April 1948. 78 people were killed, burned alive in their buses. The horror of that day seared into Jewish memory, proof that no one was safe on the roads. Each side pointed to its own losses, its own martyrs, deepening the cycle of vengeance. The British, preparing to leave, kept to their barracks more and more. Soldiers stood at checkpoints, but rarely intervened in battles. Administrators packed files in crates, preparing to sail away. For ordinary Palestinians, Arab and Jewish alike, the withdrawal of British authority meant the collapse of law and order. Families carried on daily life where they could, but the sense of security had vanished. Mothers worried about children walking to school. Farmers wondered if they could reach their fields without attack. Shopkeepers opened their shutters each morning with caution, unsure what the day would bring. By the spring of 1948, the tide of war was turning. Jewish forces, better organized and with clearer leadership, began to gain ground. They launched Plan Dalet, a military strategy designed to secure areas assigned to the Jewish state under the UN plan, as well as vital roads and supply lines. In practice, this meant capturing Arab villages and towns that stood in the way. Some residents fled in fear before battles reached them, others were expelled afterward. By May, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were already displaced, moving along roads with bundles on their backs, children trailing behind, carts loaded with whatever they could save. Entire communities vanished overnight, their homes left behind in silence. For Jews, these months were filled with both triumph and trauma. They faced heavy losses in battles, constant attacks on settlements, and shortages of weapons and food. Yet they also felt momentum building. For centuries, they had been a scattered people, but now, in the crucible of war, they were forging a state. Underground militias merged into the beginnings of a national army. Institutions that had once been informal now became the structures of governance. Amid fear and loss, there was also determination, a sense that history was finally turning their way. For Arabs, the same months felt like catastrophe unfolding. Villagers who had tilled the same fields for generations found themselves on the road, heading toward unknown futures in Lebanon, Syria, or Jordan. Refugee camps sprang up overnight, with tents pitched on barren ground, families crowded together with little food or medicine. Old people mourned homes they would never see again. Young people wondered what future remained. Leaders spoke of return, of fighting on, but despair was thick. The Nakba, the catastrophe, had begun, though no one yet knew how permanent it would become. Still, even as war raged, life in some corners continued in fragile ways. In Tel Aviv, cafes stayed open, serving bitter coffee under dim lights as sirens wailed outside. In Arab villages not yet touched by fighting, weddings were held with quiet joy, even as guests worried what tomorrow might bring. In Jerusalem, pilgrims still arrived for Easter and Passover, stepping into streets echoing with gunfire. The persistence of daily life, however fragile, showed the resilience of people determined to live despite history pressing down. On May 14, 1948, the British Mandate officially ended. The last High Commissioner sailed from Haifa Harbor, the Union Jack lowered for the final time. That same day, in Tel Aviv, Jewish leaders gathered in a hall and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. David Ben-Gurion read the declaration, his voice steady, promising freedom, justice and peace to all inhabitants, Jew and Arab alike. Outside, crowds cheered, danced, and wept. For Jews, it was the fulfillment of a dream, the rebirth of sovereignty in their ancient homeland. For Palestinians, it was the moment their catastrophe became reality. For Britain, it was the end of a difficult chapter, their soldiers departing as history erupted in their wake. The very next day, Arab armies from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, and Iraq crossed the borders, turning civil war into a regional conflict. What had begun as neighbor against neighbor now became a war of states. The fate of the land was no longer just a local struggle. It had become the center of a battle that would shape the entire Middle East. The months leading to May 1948 had shown what happens when promises collide, when suffering meets fear, when two peoples dream of the same land in different ways. The British departure did not end the struggle, it only opened the way for the next larger war. For Jews, independence had come, but survival was far from assured. For Palestinians, displacement had begun, and with it, a memory that would be carried through generations. The land itself, ancient and beautiful, was again scarred by conflict. The olive groves and orange orchards, the markets and holy places stood witness to a history that was still only beginning. Part 7, 1948, Birth and Catastrophe. The morning of May 15, 1948, was unlike any other in the history of the land. The British had left, their mandate over. The Jewish leadership had declared independence, and a new state, Israel, now existed, at least on paper. Yet even before the ink had dried on the declaration, the reality of war was pressing at its borders. Armies from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, and Iraq were already mobilizing. Lebanon, too, joined in with smaller forces. For Arab leaders, the creation of Israel was unacceptable, and they moved to crush it before it could take root. For Jewish leaders, survival itself was now at stake. The war that followed is remembered in two ways. For Jews, it was the War of Independence, a desperate fight to secure their new state against overwhelming odds. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe, when hundreds of thousands were driven from their homes, entire villages erased, and an exile began that continues to shape lives today. The same events carried both names, both truths, depending on who remembered them. In the first days after independence, the new Jewish state was fragile. It had only a few rifles and machine guns for every unit, vehicles patched together from civilian trucks, and little heavy weaponry. Yet it also had organization, morale, and a sense of urgency born from centuries of persecution and the fresh wound of the Holocaust. The militias, Haganah, Palmach, and the smaller Irgun and Lehi groups were merged into the Israel Defense Forces. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews had a national army fighting under their own flag. The Arab armies that entered had greater numbers and heavier equipment, including tanks, artillery, and aircraft. But they were not fully united, each advancing with its own goals. Egypt moved north from Gaza along the coastal plain. Transjordan's Arab Legion, commanded by British officers, advanced into the Central Hills and toward Jerusalem. Syrian and Iraqi units crossed from the east and north. In theory, this was a coordinated invasion. In practice, rivalries and poor communication weakened their strength. For civilians caught in the middle, the war meant upheaval and fear. In Arab towns and villages near the front lines, families packed belongings in haste, unsure if they would return. Some fled after hearing of massacres like Deir Yassin, terrified that they might meet the same fate. Others left because leaders urged them to move temporarily, promising they would return after victory. Still others were expelled outright by advancing Jewish forces who feared that hostile villages might aid Arab armies. The reasons varied from place to place, but the result was the same: streams of refugees on the roads, carrying what little they could, their faces lined with uncertainty. In Jewish neighborhoods, too, there was fear. Families who had lived in mixed towns like Haifa and Safed saw their Arab neighbors leave, sometimes after bitter clashes, sometimes quietly at night. Jewish convoys to Jerusalem were ambushed, leaving shortages of food and water in the besieged city. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. Every siren, every rumor of an attack, sent shivers through communities still haunted by memories of Europe. Jerusalem itself became a symbol of the struggle. The city was divided by barricades and sniper fire. In the Jewish quarter of the Old City, residents held out under siege until May, when the Arab Legion forced their surrender. Survivors were expelled, and synagogues were destroyed or left in ruins. West Jerusalem, however, remained under Jewish control, supplied by dangerous convoys through the hills. The ancient city, sacred to all three faiths, was carved in two by war, its narrow alleys echoing with gunfire instead of prayers. Elsewhere, battles shifted the map rapidly. In the north, Jewish forces secured Galilee, pushing out Arab units and capturing towns. In the south, heavy fighting with Egyptian troops raged around the Negev desert. The battles were fierce, sometimes house to house, sometimes across open fields where artillery thundered. For young soldiers, many barely out of school, the war was both terrifying and formative. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, hunger, and the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. The refugee crisis grew as the fighting spread. By the end of the war, more than 700,000 Palestinians had fled or been expelled from their homes. Villages that had stood for centuries were emptied, their stone houses left to crumble or repopulated with new arrivals. Families ended up in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Gaza. Tents stretched across barren ground. Children lined up for food rations. Elders clutched keys to houses they still hoped to return to. The camps were meant to be temporary, but for many they became permanent homes of exile. For Jews, the same months brought a flood of new immigrants. Survivors of the Holocaust, still gaunt and weary, arrived in ships and were absorbed into the new state. Jewish communities from Arab countries, fearing reprisals after the war, also began to arrive. For them, Israel was not just a refuge, but a rebirth, a place where they could begin again. The contrast was stark. As Palestinians fled, Jews poured in, each side carrying its own trauma, each shaping the land in different ways. The war dragged on into 1949, fought in phases punctuated by ceasefires brokered by the United Nations. Each truce gave civilians brief relief but also allowed both sides to regroup. By early 1949, Israel had secured control of far more land than the UN partition plan had granted. The armistice agreements left Israel in possession of about 78% of the territory, while Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Egypt held the Gaza Strip. Palestine as a planned Arab state had vanished from the map. For Jews, the outcome was celebrated as survival against impossible odds. The new state had withstood invasion, expanded its territory, and secured international recognition from major powers. The blue and white flag with the Star of David now flew over a sovereign nation. The dream of centuries had become real, but at a cost measured in thousands of lives and the enmity of neighbors. For Palestinians, the outcome was catastrophe. They had lost their homes, their villages, their future in the land they called theirs. The Nakba was not just an event, but the beginning of exile. Refugee camps became their reality, filled with longing for return. Songs, stories, and poems carried the memory of lost orchards, stone houses, and city streets now out of reach. The sense of injustice was deep, and it shaped identity for generations. In the Arab world, the war's outcome was seen as humiliation. Armies that had promised victory had been defeated. Leaders faced criticism from their own people. For Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, the war left unresolved anger and a sense that the struggle was not finished. Borders drawn in 1949 were never accepted as permanent. The land itself bore the scars. Fields lay abandoned, houses stood empty, holy sites were damaged. But the rhythms of life continued in altered form. In Tel Aviv, new immigrants built homes and schools, planting trees in celebration of their state. In refugee camps, Palestinians built makeshift communities, raising children in the hope of one day returning. In Jerusalem, divided by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers, life adjusted to partition, with families cut off from relatives just across the line. The War of 1948 ended with armistice, but not with peace. It created a new reality: Israel established, Palestinians displaced, Arab states defeated, but left every question unsettled. Where should the refugees go? What should happen to Jerusalem? Could Arabs and Jews live side by side after so much blood? These questions lingered unanswered, casting a long shadow over the years ahead. For those who lived through it, memories were vivid. Jewish families recalled dancing in the streets at the Declaration of Independence, then rushing to shelters as bombs fell. Arab families recalled the suddenness of flight, the silence of abandoned villages, the ache of exile. Each story carried pain, pride, or loss, and together they formed a history that could not be easily reconciled. The year 1948 was both a birth and a catastrophe. It was the beginning of a state and the dispersal of a people. It was joy and mourning, survival and exile. From that year onward, the struggle would no longer be about abstract promises or distant declarations. It would be about borders, refugees, wars, and the daily lives of people who still lived under the same sun and walked the same hills, yet carried very different dreams of what this land should be. Part 8. A New Map of the Middle East. When the guns of 1948 fell silent, the land looked different. What had once been known as the British Mandate of Palestine no longer existed. In its place was a patchwork carved by war. The State of Israel now controlled about 3/4 of the territory, far more than the United Nations had assigned in its partition plan. To the east, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan annexed the West Bank and took control of East Jerusalem, including the Old City with its sacred sites. To the southwest, Egypt held the narrow Gaza Strip, a crowded sliver along the sea. Palestine as a sovereign state existed only in memory and in the hearts of those who had fled. For Jewish citizens of the new state, the war's end was a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. They had survived against odds that had seemed impossible. In Tel Aviv, Haifa, and the kibbutzim of Galilee and the Negev, people planted trees, built schools, and opened businesses. Streets were named, flags were raised, and government ministries began their work in makeshift offices. Yet beneath the pride lay grief. Thousands of lives had been lost, many communities destroyed, and memories of siege and hunger remained raw. Still, there was determination to build. Families who had arrived with nothing now laid bricks for homes, dug irrigation ditches, and taught Hebrew to children who had spoken only Yiddish, Ladino, or Arabic. The state was fragile, but it was alive. For Palestinians, the aftermath of 1948 was defined by exile. More than 700,000 people had fled or been expelled, and now they found themselves scattered across the Arab world. In Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, refugee camps grew into towns of canvas and tin. Rows of tents stretched across open ground, later replaced by concrete shelters. Families shared stories of villages they had left behind, of orchards heavy with olives, of wells that had quenched generations, of stone houses now empty or occupied by others. The keys to those homes became treasured symbols, kept carefully in drawers or tied to belts, tokens of a return they still believed would come. Life in the camps was hard. Food was distributed in rations, water carried in buckets, education provided in crowded classrooms run by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Children grew up surrounded by loss, their lullabies filled with memories of places they had never seen. Mothers tried to keep traditions alive, baking bread on small stoves, embroidering dresses with patterns from their villages. Fathers searched for work in nearby cities, often taking the lowest-paying jobs. The camps were meant to be temporary, but they soon became permanent fixtures, shaping a Palestinian identity rooted in longing and resilience. In Jordan, the annexation of the West Bank created new realities. Palestinians there became Jordanian citizens, and cities like Nablus, Hebron, and Jericho were absorbed into the Hashemite kingdom. Life continued with relative calm, markets bustling with fruit and spices, schools teaching in Arabic under Jordanian rule. But the memory of displacement lingered. Families who had fled from Haifa or Jaffa lived beside those whose roots remained in the West Bank, creating a society both unified and divided by experience. In Gaza, the situation was more precarious. The Strip, only a few miles wide and crowded with refugees, was administered by Egypt but never annexed. Its people lived in limbo, with little opportunity to travel or work beyond its borders. Camps there were especially dense, and life was harsh. Yet amid poverty, culture endured. Storytellers recited epic poems, fishermen cast nets from the shore, and children played among alleys lined with tents. Gaza became a symbol of both survival and confinement. For Israel, the 1950s were years of building. Immigrants poured in not only from Europe, but also from Arab countries. In Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Casablanca, Jewish communities that had existed for centuries faced new hostility after the war. Many left or were expelled, their synagogues abandoned, their shops closed. They arrived in Israel with few possessions, joining Holocaust survivors in transit camps hastily built to shelter them. Rows of tin huts stood on barren ground, dust swirling in the wind, families crowded into single rooms. Conditions were difficult, but there was a sense of shared purpose. Together, they would build a new society. The state struggled with shortages. Food was rationed, jobs scarce, and housing inadequate. Yet there was determination to endure. Hebrew became the unifying language, taught in schools and spoken on the radio. New cities rose on the coastal plain, while kibbutzim expanded in the countryside. The desert was planted with forests, irrigation projects turned dry soil green, and electricity spread to villages. Each achievement was celebrated as proof that the state could not only survive but thrive. Still, Israel was surrounded by hostility. The Arab states refused to recognize it, insisting that the war was not over, only paused. Borders were tense, marked by skirmishes and infiltrations. Palestinian refugees, desperate to return to their homes, often crossed the lines at night to retrieve possessions or harvest crops, only to be confronted by Israeli patrols. These infiltrations, as they were called, sometimes ended in violence, fueling cycles of reprisal. Armistice agreements had drawn borders on maps, but they had not created peace. Jerusalem was divided. Barbed wire and walls cut the city in two. On the western side, Israel declared its capital, though few nations recognized it. Government offices operated in hastily converted buildings, flags flew, and new neighborhoods were built. On the eastern side, under Jordanian control, the old city remained closed to Jews who could no longer pray at the Western Wall. Pilgrims from abroad still came to Christian and Muslim holy sites, but the city of shared faiths was fractured. Families were separated by the line, unable to cross to see relatives who lived only a few streets away. For Palestinians who had remained within Israel's new borders, life was complex. About 150,000 Arabs lived inside the state after 1948, a small minority in a Jewish-majority country. They were granted citizenship but lived under military administration with restrictions on movement and politics. Their villages were often poor, their lands reduced, yet their presence kept alive the thread of continuity. They tilled fields, called the adhan from minarets, and sent their children to schools, holding on to identity in a state that often viewed them with suspicion. The wider Arab world responded to 1948 with anger and a determination to resist. Radio broadcasts spoke of liberation, leaders promised that the refugees would return, and armies prepared for another round of conflict. In Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, streets filled with demonstrations, flags waving, voices shouting for Palestine. The defeat of 1948 was seen not only as a Palestinian tragedy but as a wound to Arab pride. Many believed the struggle had only begun. In daily life, however, people on all sides sought normalcy where they could. In Tel Aviv, cafes served strong coffee, and theaters staged plays in Hebrew. In Amman, markets sold spices, fabrics, and sweets to new Palestinian citizens adjusting to life under Jordanian rule. In Gaza, fishermen returned with nets heavy with sardines, sold quickly to families cooking over open fires. In refugee camps, children played football on dusty fields, their laughter rising above the hardship. Life pressed forward, stubborn and insistent, even when politics seemed unbearable. The 1950s were a decade of uneasy quiet. There were no full-scale wars, but there was no peace either. Refugees remained in their camps, Israel built its institutions, and the Arab states prepared for the next confrontation. Beneath the surface, anger and hope smoldered. Palestinians waited for return, their memories carefully preserved. Israelis worked to secure their state, determined never again to face annihilation. The new map of the Middle East had been drawn, but it was fragile. Borders were lines of ceasefire, not of agreement. The land was divided among new rulers, but its people carried unresolved dreams. The olive groves, the stone villages, the cities of prayer and commerce, all stood witness to a history that was still unfolding, a history that promised more turbulence in the years to come. Part 9. 6 Days That Changed Everything. The 1950s and early 1960s passed in a tense stillness. Israel had survived its birth, but its borders were fragile lines of ceasefire rather than recognized frontiers. Palestinians remained in exile, waiting and hoping, while Arab states promised that time was on their side. Across the region, radio stations carried fiery speeches, promising liberation in return. In refugee camps, children grew up hearing those words, repeating them with conviction, even as they played on dusty fields or helped their parents fetch water from communal taps. In Israel, life pressed forward with the energy of a young state. Cities expanded, new immigrants continued to arrive, and Hebrew culture flourished in schools, theaters, and newspapers. Yet the sense of siege never lifted. Armed infiltrations, border skirmishes, and occasional raids kept tension high. Families in villages near the border slept lightly, listening for distant gunfire or the sudden wail of alarms. For many Israelis, survival felt provisional, dependent on constant vigilance. By the mid-1960s, the region was shifting. Arab nationalism was on the rise, embodied in the figure of Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. His speeches echoed across radios in Cairo, Damascus, Ammon, and beyond, promising unity and strength, vowing that Palestine would be liberated. Crowds cheered, banners waved, and the sense of inevitability grew that another clash with Israel was approaching. For Palestinians, Nasser's words were a source of pride and hope, a voice declaring that their exile would not last forever. Small clashes escalated. Palestinian guerrilla groups, operating from bases in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, carried out raids into Israel. They were often small, a mine placed on a road, a sudden ambush, but each act brought retaliation. Israeli forces struck back with raids on villages or military posts across the border. These cycles of violence hardened attitudes on both sides. In Israel, citizens demanded security. In Arab states, leaders spoke of revenge and dignity. By 1967, the pressure had reached breaking point. In May of that year, Nasser ordered the withdrawal of United Nations peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula, which had been stationed there since the Suez Crisis a decade earlier. Egyptian troops moved in, tanks rolling across the desert under the glaring sun. Soon after, Nasser announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, cutting off a vital trade route. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, these moves were seen as acts of war. Across the Arab world, the mood was electric. Radio broadcasts declared that the time of reckoning had come. In Damascus, posters proclaimed unity. In Amman, volunteers trained with rifles. In Gaza and the West Bank, families whispered that return was near. Palestinian refugees packed belongings, expecting they would soon be going home. In Israel, anxiety gripped the nation. Families dug trenches and shelters, fearing invasion. Gas masks were distributed, and hospitals prepared for mass casualties. Many remembered the Holocaust, only 2 decades behind them, and feared annihilation. Yet military leaders quietly planned a preemptive strike. Israel's survival, they believed, depended on acting first. On the morning of June 5, 1967, Israeli aircraft roared into the sky. Flying low and fast to avoid radar, they struck Egyptian airfields in a sudden, devastating attack. Within hours, the Egyptian Air Force was crippled, its planes destroyed on the ground. The balance of power had shifted before the Arab armies could move. The war that followed lasted only 6 days, but it reshaped the region for generations. Israeli forces advanced swiftly. In the Sinai, they pushed Egyptian troops back across the desert, capturing vast stretches of sand and mountains. In the east, they fought Jordanian forces in fierce battles for Jerusalem and the West Bank. In the north, they clashed with Syrian troops on the steep cliffs of the Golan Heights. In Jerusalem, the fighting was intense. Jordanian artillery shelled Jewish neighborhoods, while Israeli forces advanced through narrow streets under sniper fire. After 2 days, the old city was surrounded. On June 7th, Israeli paratroopers broke through the Lion's Gate and entered the walled city. For the first time since 1948, Jews reached the Western Wall. Soldiers wept, pressed their hands against ancient stones, and sang prayers that echoed through alleys scarred by battle. For Israelis, it was a moment of profound triumph, a reunion with a place central to their history. For Palestinians, it was a bitter loss, the fall of East Jerusalem and the West Bank into occupation. In the north, the battle for the Golan Heights was fierce. Israeli troops climbed rugged slopes under fire, determined to silence the artillery that had shelled their villages below. After days of heavy fighting, the plateau was captured. To the south, the Sinai Peninsula fell under Israeli control, its vast expanses crossed by tanks and convoys raising dust clouds in the desert heat. By June 10th, it was over. In less than a week, Israel had captured the Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The map of the Middle East had been transformed. What had seemed, at the start, a war of survival ended as a stunning military victory. But beneath the triumph lay consequences that would shape every day that followed. For Palestinians, the outcome was devastating. Hundreds of thousands more became refugees, fleeing the West Bank and Gaza as battles swept through their towns. Families crossed the Jordan River, joining camps already crowded with those displaced in 1948. Villages that had expected liberation instead found themselves under Israeli control. The occupation began quietly, with soldiers setting up checkpoints in new military administrations. Families woke to find their lives suddenly changed, their fields and markets now overseen by foreign troops. For Israelis, the war brought both exhilaration and unease. The Western Wall was in their hands, and the land that had once been central to biblical history, Judea, Samaria, the Galilee Hills, was suddenly under their control. Crowds celebrated, flags waved, and euphoria filled the streets. Yet alongside pride came questions. What would become of the millions of Palestinians now living under Israeli rule? Could a small state hold on to so much territory, or was this a temporary occupation? These questions would linger without answer, shaping debates for decades. In Arab capitals, the shock was profound. The armies that had promised victory were defeated in less than a week. Egypt, Jordan, and Syria faced humiliation. Nasser admitted the defeat, but vowed to continue resistance. Across the Arab world, protests erupted, governments trembled, and a sense of betrayal spread among the people. For Palestinians, hope had turned to despair. Instead of returning to their homes, they now lived under occupation or in camps across the region. The Nakba, the setback, became the new name for 1967, a second catastrophe following the first. Daily life adjusted to the new reality. In the West Bank, farmers continued to tend their olives and wheat, but now under the watch of Israeli soldiers. Markets in Hebron and Nablus stayed busy, though with new restrictions and permits. In Gaza, already crowded with refugees, conditions worsened under military rule. Checkpoints appeared on roads, curfews were imposed, and families learned to live with the presence of patrols. Yet amid the hardship, weddings were still celebrated, children still studied in schools, and prayers still rose from mosques and churches. In Israel, the victory brought a sense of security that many had never felt before. Families walked through the alleys of the old city, visiting holy sites long out of reach. Tourists arrived to see the new borders. Settlers, inspired by religious conviction or national pride, began to speak of living once more in the biblical heartland. The seeds of future settlements were planted in those days, though few could yet see how large they would grow. The Six-Day War was short, but its echoes stretched far into the future. It redrew the map, deepened divisions, and created a new reality of occupation and unresolved questions. For Israelis, it was proof of strength and survival. For Palestinians, it was another wound, another chapter of displacement and loss. For the Arab world, it was a call to regroup and resist. And for the land itself, it was another scar. Olive groves watched tanks roll past. Ancient stones of Jerusalem heard both prayers of joy and cries of mourning. The desert sands of Sinai were marked by the tracks of armies. The hills of the Golan fell silent after battles, the sound of artillery replaced by the whisper of wind. Life as always continued, but it was changed forever by 6 days in June. Part 10. From Hope to Stalemate. The summer of 1967 left the region transformed. Israel now held territories several times larger than its original borders. The Sinai stretched like a vast desert shield to the south. The Golan Heights rose above Galilee in the north. To the east lay the West Bank, with its crowded towns, villages, and fertile valleys. Gaza, already heavy with refugees, was under military rule. For Israelis, this was a breathtaking change. For Palestinians and the wider Arab world, it was a humiliation and a challenge that demanded response. In the first months after the Six-Day War, the atmosphere was unsettled but not yet explosive. In Israel, citizens marveled at the new map. Families walked through the streets of the old city of Jerusalem, praying at the Western Wall for the first time in nearly 20 years. Soldiers guided their parents to sites they had dreamed of but never seen. Some spoke of biblical prophecies fulfilled, of ancient homelands restored. Others felt pride tempered by unease, sensing that occupation of so many people and places would not be simple. In Palestinian towns now under Israeli control, life shifted abruptly. Farmers found their fields cut by checkpoints. Markets bustled, but under the eyes of soldiers. Identity cards were issued, curfews imposed, and rules enforced by military governors. Refugees from 1948 who had hoped for return now lived under a new authority, one that spoke another language and carried another flag. Families in Hebron, Nablus, and Gaza adjusted to this daily reality with resilience, but also with simmering anger. The Arab states reeled from their defeat. In Cairo, Nasser admitted the loss but swore that resistance would continue. His speeches, once filled with confidence, now carried tones of determination mixed with sorrow. Across the Arab world, leaders gathered in Khartoum and issued their famous declaration, "No peace with Israel, no recognition, no negotiations." The three no's became the official stance, a wall of rejection built from the pain of defeat. Refugee camps echoed with the same words, spoken with conviction by families who had lost everything. Meanwhile, Israel debated what to do with its new territories. Some argued that the land should be exchanged for peace, that Israel could not hold on to so much indefinitely. Others believed it was destiny, that these lands were part of the Jewish homeland and should never be surrendered. The government hesitated, testing the waters of diplomacy but finding little response. The new borders were drawn on maps, but in the minds of many, they remained temporary lines awaiting negotiation. As the 1970s approached, the balance of the region shifted again. Nasser's Egypt, though weakened, rebuilt its army with Soviet support. Syria, too, rearmed, determined to regain the Golan Heights. Jordan, though quieter, prepared for the future. Palestinian guerrilla groups grew bolder, striking across borders and building a sense of national identity that had been absent before. The Palestine Liberation Organization, founded in 1964, gained strength, its leaders speaking of liberation through struggle. Posters and slogans appeared in camps and cities, declaring that Palestine still lived, even in exile. For ordinary people, daily life was shaped by these larger currents but filled with its own details. In Israeli towns, new immigrants arrived from Eastern Europe, bringing with them languages, music, and memories of another continent. In Palestinian villages, weddings were celebrated with drumbeats and ululations, even under curfew. In Gaza, children played soccer between the lines of tents, their games briefly suspending the weight of politics. In Jerusalem, divided no more, pilgrims of all faiths filled the streets, marveling at the coexistence of holiness and tension. The stalemate did not last forever. In October 1973, during the holy month of Ramadan and on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal, overwhelming Israeli positions on the eastern bank. Syrian troops surged down from the Golan Heights, pressing into territory that had been lost 6 years before. For Israel, the shock was profound. Families rushed to shelters, radios crackled with urgent news, and the fear of annihilation returned. Soldiers were called from synagogues and farms, barely pausing in their prayers or their work before heading to the front. The early days of the Yom Kippur War were grim for Israel. Casualties mounted, and the sense of vulnerability cut deep. But as the weeks passed, Israeli forces regrouped. In the Sinai, they crossed the canal in reverse, encircling Egyptian armies. On the Golan, they pushed Syrian troops back and advanced toward Damascus. By the time a ceasefire was declared, Israel had regained its ground and more. The war had not destroyed the state, but it had shaken it to the core. For Egypt, the war was both loss and victory. Militarily, it ended in stalemate. Politically, however, it restored Arab pride. Crossing the canal, even briefly, had shown that Israel was not invincible. For Syrians, the bitterness of losing the Golan remained, fueling decades of tension. For Palestinians, the war was another reminder that their fate was tied to battles fought by others, their own voice still emerging, but not yet decisive. The aftermath of the Yom Kippur War opened new doors. For the first time, serious discussions of peace began. Egypt's President Anwar Sadat, bold and pragmatic, recognized that endless war would not restore what had been lost. In 1977, he stunned the world by visiting Jerusalem, standing in the Knesset, and speaking of peace. Israelis watched in awe as an Arab leader walked their capital. Palestinians watched with mixed feelings, uncertain whether their cause would be advanced or abandoned. These years were filled with contradictions. Hope flickered in diplomacy, yet violence continued in camps and along borders. Israeli settlers began moving into the West Bank and Gaza, building new homes on hilltops under army protection. Palestinians saw this as a deepening of occupation, a theft of their land. Israelis saw it as security or fulfillment of history. Refugee camps swelled with frustration, while Israeli towns swelled with growth. The stalemate deepened, even as peace was whispered on the horizon. For ordinary families, life carried its dual rhythms of hardship and persistence. In Tel Aviv, children learned in schools newly built, their teachers instructing them in Hebrew literature and science. In Amman, Palestinian refugees worked in shops and offices, sending money to relatives in camps. In Cairo, families listened to Sadat's speeches with hope and anxiety. In the villages of the West Bank, farmers rose at dawn to tend olive groves, passing through checkpoints that had become part of daily life. In Gaza, fishermen cast their nets into the sea, their catch small but vital. The years after 1967 and 1973 created a paradox. Wars had redrawn maps, but peace had not yet redrawn hearts. Israel felt stronger militarily than ever, yet more isolated diplomatically. Palestinians felt more visible as a people, yet more displaced than before. Arab states spoke of unity, yet pursued their own agendas. The conflict had entered a phase not of resolution, but of endurance. A long stalemate marked by flashes of hope and bursts of despair. The land itself absorbed these changes quietly. The stones of Jerusalem bore new footsteps, tourists and soldiers alike. The Sinai desert echoed with the silence of abandoned battlefields. The hills of the West Bank watched over settlers' new houses and villagers' old olive trees. The Gaza shoreline shimmered under the sun, waves lapping its shores crowded with tents and homes. Time moved forward, seasons turned, children were born, elders passed on, but the struggle remained. The stage was set for a new chapter. Diplomacy would bring peace between some, but not for all. Palestinians would grow louder in their demands. Israelis would continue to debate security and settlement. The Arab world would shift between confrontation and negotiation. Out of the stalemate, the future would take shape, uncertain but inevitable. Part 11. The First Intifada. The years after the Yom Kippur War settled into a heavy stillness. The guns were mostly silent, yet the conflict had not been resolved. Israel had proved its strength but faced new dilemmas. Egypt, after Sadat's bold journey to Jerusalem, moved cautiously toward peace. Jordan maintained a fragile balance. Syria held to its bitterness. And Palestinians, spread across camps, towns, and villages, began to discover that their fate could no longer rest only in the hands of others. By the late 1970s, the Palestine Liberation Organization had grown into a powerful symbol. Its leader, Yasser Arafat, with his trademark keffiyeh draped across his shoulder, became the face of Palestinian identity. From bases in Lebanon, the PLO launched raids into Israel and against Israeli positions in the occupied territories. Guerrillas carried rifles and carried dreams of liberation, yet their attacks often provoked devastating reprisals. For many Palestinians, the PLO was both hope and hardship, a banner of their cause but also a magnet for violence. In 1979, peace between Egypt and Israel changed the regional landscape. Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem began signed the Camp David Accords, brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter. The Sinai was returned to Egypt, and for the first time, an Arab state formally recognized Israel. Crowds in Israel celebrated, seeing peace with their largest neighbor as a miracle. In Cairo, reactions were mixed, some hopeful, others outraged that Palestine seemed forgotten in the deal. For Palestinians, it was a moment of betrayal. They had long believed that Arab states would fight for their return. Now the strongest Arab power had signed peace without resolving their plight. In the 1980s, tensions in the occupied territories deepened. The West Bank and Gaza were filled with growing populations, both Palestinian and Israeli. Settlements expanded, their red-tiled roofs rising on hilltops above olive groves. Roads were built to connect them, patrolled by soldiers. For Palestinians, these settlements were daily reminders that their land was slipping further away. Checkpoints multiplied, curfews were imposed, and identity cards controlled movement. Life became a series of restrictions, where one could work, when one could travel, whether a son or brother would be detained. In Gaza, conditions were particularly harsh. The Strip, crowded with refugees since 1948, had doubled and tripled in population. Camps were filled with narrow alleys, children playing between rows of cinder block homes, families struggling with unemployment and poverty. Yet amid hardship, resilience endured. Women baked bread on small stoves, boys flew kites above rooftops, fishermen cast nets into the sea. Life insisted on itself, even in confinement. In Israel, society wrestled with its own contradictions. On one hand, there was pride in achievements. Agriculture flourished, universities grew, technology advanced. On the other, there was unease about ruling over another people. Some argued that holding the territories was necessary for security. Others warned that occupation would corrode Israel's soul. Debates filled newspapers, parliaments, and dinner tables as families argued over the future. By the late 1980s, the pressure could no longer be contained. On December 9, 1987, in Gaza, a traffic accident became the spark. An Israeli truck collided with Palestinian workers, killing 4. Rumors spread quickly that it was intentional, though it was not. Funerals drew crowds, anger erupted, and the first stones were thrown at soldiers. From Gaza, the unrest spread to the West Bank, igniting what became known as the First Intifada, the uprising. The Intifada was unlike anything before. It was not led by armies or states, but by ordinary people. Young Palestinians, many only teenagers, filled the streets. They carried stones and slingshots, facing soldiers armed with rifles. Tires burned at crossroads, graffiti-covered walls, and neighborhoods organized committees to coordinate protests. Women played a central role, organizing food supplies, first aid, and education when schools were closed. Strikes and boycotts spread, markets shuttered, and daily life became a form of resistance. For Israel, the uprising was a shock. Soldiers trained for conventional war now faced unarmed civilians and children. Checkpoints became battlegrounds of stones and tear gas. Television screens around the world showed images of young boys hurling rocks at tanks, soldiers chasing crowds through narrow alleys. These images reshaped global opinion, painting the occupation in stark light. Within Israel, the Intifada divided society further. Some demanded harsher measures, insisting that order had to be restored. Others began to question whether holding the territories was sustainable, whether peace must finally be pursued. For Palestinians, the Intifada was both empowerment and suffering. It gave voice to a generation that had grown up in camps and under occupation. They no longer waited for Arab armies to liberate them. They acted themselves. Yet the cost was heavy. Hundreds were killed, thousands injured, and many imprisoned. Families mourned sons and daughters. Yet the spirit of resistance spread from town to town, camp to camp. Daily life during the uprising was a mixture of hardship and creativity. When schools closed, teachers held classes in mosques or private homes. When curfews confined families, neighbors whispered stories across rooftops, sharing news and encouragement. Weddings were small, held quietly under watchful eyes, yet they carried defiance, the continuation of life itself. Mothers taught children songs of resilience. Fathers told tales of lost villages. Elders spoke of patience. The world began to take notice. Journalists covered the uprising. Diplomats debated resolutions, and the Palestinian cause moved from the margins to the center of international politics. The PLO, long exiled in Tunisia after being forced from Lebanon, declared recognition of Israel in 1988 and called for a two-state solution. For the first time, Palestinian leadership publicly accepted coexistence, even as violence continued in the streets. For Israelis, the Intifada forced reflection. Soldiers wrote letters home, confessing unease at confronting children with rifles in hand. Families in Tel Aviv watched the news with discomfort, torn between fear of attacks and sympathy for the plight of their neighbors. Political debates grew louder, some calling for negotiation, others warning that concessions would bring only danger. The uprising did not end Israel's control of the territories, but it shook the certainty of permanence. By the early 1990s, the Intifada was losing momentum, worn down by exhaustion, repression, and internal divisions. But its legacy remained. It had given Palestinians a voice of their own, distinct from Arab states. It had shown the world the human face of occupation, and it had opened a door, however fragile, to negotiations. The Oslo Accords lay just ahead, born from the realization that neither side could impose its will forever. The First Intifada was not just a chapter of violence, but a chapter of awakening. For Palestinians, it was a declaration that they were not forgotten, that they were a people with rights and identity. For Israelis, it was a mirror held up to their occupation, forcing questions long avoided. For the world, it was a reminder that history is not only shaped by leaders and armies, but by ordinary people with stones in their hands and determination in their hearts. And through it all, life continued. Markets reopened after strikes, children returned to classrooms, farmers pruned their olive trees, and prayers rose from minarets and churches alike. The land bore witness as it always had, ancient and patient, holding within it the stories of both hope and hardship. Part 12. A Handshake on the Lawn. The late 1980s and early 1990s brought a quiet but undeniable shift. The First Intifada had shaken the region, drawing the world's attention to the Palestinian struggle and forcing Israel to confront the reality of ruling over another people. The uprising was slowly losing energy, worn down by years of confrontation, but its impact lingered. It had shown that Palestinians were not merely refugees in camps or subjects under occupation. They were a people who demanded to be seen. Out of this awakening grew an opening, fragile and uncertain, for diplomacy. International changes added to the possibility. The Cold War, which had long shaped alliances, was coming to an end. The Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, the rigid divisions of global politics began to soften. In Washington, leaders spoke of a new order, one that might bring peace to long-standing conflicts. In Europe, too, there was interest in mediation, in finally resolving the question that had burned for decades in the Middle East. For Palestinians, the years of the Intifada had created both pride and exhaustion. Families in the camps were weary of curfews, closures, and funerals. They longed for normal life, for schools to stay open, for markets to bustle without fear, for children to grow without stones in their hands. In the occupied territories, the daily presence of soldiers weighed heavily, yet the uprising had also given them recognition. The Palestine Liberation Organization, long based abroad, now found itself at the center of international attention. Yasser Arafat, once seen by many as a guerrilla leader, was being invited to the halls of diplomacy. In Israel, the uprising had also left its mark. The images of soldiers confronting children, broadcast around the world, troubled many. Politicians debated the future of the territories with a new urgency. Some argued that the occupation was unsustainable, that peace must be pursued. Others warned that negotiating with the PLO would mean rewarding violence. Yet even among skeptics, there was recognition that something had to change. The status quo could not last forever. The Madrid Conference of 1991 was the first step. Convened after the Gulf War, it brought Israelis and Palestinians, along with Arab states, to the same table. Though little concrete was achieved, the symbolism was powerful. For the first time, Palestinians were not represented solely by Arab governments, but spoke for themselves. The door to direct negotiation had been cracked open. The real breakthrough came quietly, far from cameras, in the Norwegian capital of Oslo. In secret meetings, Israeli academics and Palestinian officials began to talk. At first, they were cautious, testing each other's words, feeling out possibilities. Over time, trust grew, and drafts were written. The talks moved from theory to practicality. What would autonomy look like? How could security be guaranteed? What steps could be taken first? The process was delicate, filled with setbacks and breakthroughs, but it moved forward. In September 1993, the world watched in astonishment as Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister, and Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO, stood on the White House lawn. Between them stood President Bill Clinton, his arms outstretched as though bridging a gulf of history. Rabin, a general who had once commanded armies against Palestinians, extended his hand reluctantly. Arafat, long seen as the face of armed struggle, reached forward eagerly. Their handshake was brief, awkward, yet monumental. For many, it was a moment they never believed they would see. The Oslo Accords promised limited self-rule for Palestinians in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Israel would withdraw from certain areas, and the newly formed Palestinian Authority would govern them. Elections would be held, police forces established, and negotiations on final status would continue. For the first time, Palestinians would have official recognition of their right to govern themselves, and Israelis would have recognition from the PLO that their state had the right to exist. In the streets, reactions were mixed. In Gaza and Ramallah, crowds gathered to celebrate, waving flags, chanting slogans, and dreaming of independence. Children painted doves on walls, and musicians played songs of peace. In Israel, many were hopeful, believing that the conflict might finally end. Yet there was also unease. Some Israelis feared that the agreement was a trap, that concessions would bring only more violence. Some Palestinians felt betrayed, believing that too much had been given away while refugees remained in camps and settlements continued to grow. The handshake on the lawn was powerful, but it could not erase decades of mistrust overnight. Daily life in the mid-1990s carried the flavor of both hope and fragility. In the newly autonomous areas, Palestinian police patrolled streets instead of Israeli soldiers. Flags of the Palestinian Authority fluttered over government buildings, a symbol of dignity after years of occupation. Schools taught lessons infused with the promise of self-determination. Markets bustled with new energy, and weddings were celebrated with a sense of optimism. Families spoke of the possibility that their children might grow up free. In Israel, too, there was a sense of possibility. Buses carried commuters through towns without fear of ambush. Newspapers wrote of a new Middle East where trade and cooperation might replace hostility. Cafes filled with conversations about peace, and even skeptics allowed themselves cautious optimism. Tourists returned in greater numbers, drawn by the idea of witnessing history in the making. Yet beneath the surface, shadows remained. Extremists on both sides opposed the accords. Some Palestinians rejected the idea of two states, insisting that all of Palestine must be reclaimed. Some Israelis denounced the agreements as surrender, accusing Rabin of endangering security. Acts of violence continued, shaking trust. Suicide bombings in Israeli cities killed civilians and spread fear. Settler attacks on Palestinians deepened bitterness. Each incident weakened the fragile fabric of hope woven in Oslo. The most devastating blow came in November 1995, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist who opposed the peace process. At his funeral, leaders from around the world gathered, mourning a man who had turned from soldier to peacemaker. For many Israelis and Palestinians, his death felt like the loss of a chance. Without him, the process faltered. In the years that followed, negotiations continued but grew more strained. The promise of Oslo was never fully realized. The Palestinian Authority struggled with corruption, inefficiency, and the challenge of building institutions under occupation. Israel hesitated on further withdrawals, citing security concerns and rising violence. Settlements expanded, eating away at Palestinian trust. Refugees remained in camps, their future unresolved. Jerusalem, borders, and the right of return, the core issues, were left for later, and later never came. Still, the Oslo years left a mark. They gave Palestinians a measure of self-rule, however limited. They gave Israelis recognition from a people who had long denied their legitimacy. They created moments of genuine hope when doves were painted on walls and peace songs played on radios. They also created deep disappointment when promises faded and violence returned. For ordinary people, the 1990s were years of contradiction. In Ramallah, families shopped in new stores but also endured closures and curfews when violence flared. In Tel Aviv, children studied English and math in classrooms while parents worried about buses exploding in attacks. In Gaza, fishermen returned with their catch, but restrictions on movement tightened. In refugee camps, children grew up learning both the language of peace and the stories of lost villages. Life was filled with both possibility and fragility. The handshake on the White House lawn remains one of the most enduring images of the conflict. For some, it symbolizes hope betrayed. For others, it remains proof that even the deepest enmities can be bridged, if only briefly. It was a moment when the world paused, when two hands reached across history and touched, however awkwardly, in the name of peace. And yet, when the celebrations ended, reality returned. The land remained divided, its people still caught in the web of borders, checkpoints, and unresolved questions. The dream of peace had been glimpsed, but it slipped quickly back into uncertainty. Part 13. The Second Intifada. The promise of Oslo lingered into the late 1990s like the fading light of a sunset. For a time, there was color and warmth, a belief that peace might come at last. But as the decade turned, shadows lengthened. Negotiations stalled. Promises made in handshakes and documents became tangled in disputes over land, settlements, refugees, and Jerusalem. The core questions remained unanswered, and without answers, mistrust grew. For Palestinians, daily life under the Palestinian Authority was a mixture of pride and frustration. Flags flew over schools and offices, police patrolled in new uniforms, and there was a sense of self-governance that had not existed before. Yet the authority was limited, and Israeli checkpoints still controlled movement. Refugee camps remained crowded. Settlements expanded on hilltops, their red roofs visible from nearby villages. Families watched the growth of those communities with anger and despair, wondering if the land left to them would ever form a state. For Israelis, too, contradictions abounded. They had recognition from the PLO and a sense that peace might be possible, but suicide bombings in buses, cafes, and markets left scars. Children were killed on their way to school, families shattered at weddings. The fear of sudden violence became part of daily life. Support for negotiations wavered, and skepticism spread. The final attempt to reach a lasting peace came in the summer of 2000 at Camp David. U.S. President Bill Clinton brought together Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. For weeks, they debated the most difficult issues: borders, security, Jerusalem, the right of return for refugees. Progress was made, but mistrust remained. In the end, no agreement was reached. Clinton spoke of a missed opportunity. Arafat felt the offer was inadequate. Barak returned to Israel disappointed. The hopes of the 1990s seemed to crumble. Only months later, in September 2000, a spark ignited the Second Intifada. Ariel Sharon, a prominent Israeli politician, visited the Temple Mount, known to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif, one of the holiest sites in the world. To Palestinians, the visit felt like a provocation, a signal that their sacred places were under threat. Protests erupted in Jerusalem, quickly spreading to the West Bank and Gaza. The demonstrations were met with force, and soon stones gave way to bullets. Within days, the uprising had become a storm. The Second Intifada was far more violent than the first. Suicide bombings shook Israeli cities. Restaurants, buses, and shopping malls became targets. Ordinary life was pierced by sudden explosions, leaving shattered glass, twisted metal, and lives cut short. Families grieved, communities mourned, and fear became constant. For Israelis, the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. Soldiers were sent to guard cafes, checkpoints multiplied, and the dream of coexistence seemed to vanish. In the West Bank and Gaza, the Israeli response was fierce. Tanks rolled into towns, helicopters circled above, and curfews locked families in their homes for days at a time. Streets once filled with markets and school children fell silent under the rumble of armored vehicles. Night raids became common, doors broken down, young men taken away. Refugee camps endured sieges, with water and electricity cut, families cooking what little they had over small fires. Jerusalem, sacred and contested, became a flashpoint once more. In its alleys and markets, clashes erupted, and the line between sacred and political blurred. The holy city echoed with chants, gunfire, and the cries of mourners. Families that had prayed for peace a few years earlier now prayed for survival. The uprising lasted for years, leaving deep scars. For Palestinians, the cost was immense. Thousands were killed, many more injured, and the fragile infrastructure of their self-rule was shattered. Towns were left in ruins, unemployment soared, and despair spread through the camps. Yet for many, the uprising was also an expression of anger and dignity, a refusal to accept occupation without resistance. For Israelis, the Intifada reinforced fears of annihilation. The sight of buses destroyed, of families mourning in cemeteries, hardened hearts. Many who had once believed in negotiations now turned to leaders who promised security above all else. Ariel Sharon, whose visit had sparked the uprising, was elected prime minister, vowing to bring order with strength. One of the most enduring legacies of the Second Intifada was the construction of a separation barrier. In 2002, Israel began building walls and fences across the West Bank, citing the need to prevent suicide bombers from entering its cities. The barrier cut through fields, villages, and neighborhoods, dividing families and farmers from their land. To Israelis, it became a shield credited with reducing attacks. To Palestinians, it was a prison wall, concrete rising high above their homes, a symbol of separation and loss. Daily life during these years was marked by constant tension. In Israeli towns, parents hesitated before sending children on buses, scanning the faces of passengers with fear. Weddings and celebrations were held under the shadow of possible attack. In Palestinian towns, markets opened only when curfews lifted, and children learned their lessons by candlelight during blackouts. Weddings, too, continued, often modest, defiant acts of life amid despair. The international community watched with alarm. Diplomats proposed plans, envoys traveled between capitals, but violence drowned out words. The peace process that had once seemed within reach now felt impossibly distant. The handshake on the White House lawn faded into memory, replaced by images of rubble, funerals, and walls. By the mid-2000s, the Intifada slowed, worn down by exhaustion, repression, and the heavy toll it had taken on both societies. But the damage was lasting. Trust, already fragile, was broken. Israelis and Palestinians withdrew further into their own narratives of fear and loss. The hope of the 1990s was gone, replaced by bitterness and fatigue. And yet, even in those darkest years, life continued. In Gaza, fishermen still set out at dawn, casting nets into the sea. In West Bank villages, farmers tended olive trees, harvesting fruit under the watch of soldiers. In Israeli cities, children studied in schools, their laughter mingling with the sound of sirens. In refugee camps, women baked bread, the smell rising above crowded alleys. Life refused to end, even as violence threatened to consume it. The Second Intifada was a chapter of deep pain, a time when hope collapsed into violence and mistrust. It left wounds that would not easily heal. But it also showed the endurance of ordinary people, those who still planted, cooked, studied, prayed, and dreamed beneath the same sky, waiting for a future that remained elusive. Part 14: Withdrawal and Division. When the Second Intifada began to fade in the mid-2000s, the land it left behind was bruised and weary. Years of violence had taken lives on both sides, broken trust, and reshaped daily existence. In Israel, there was a sense of fatigue, a desire to find security in new ways. In Palestinian towns and camps, there was grief and anger, but also exhaustion from years of funerals and curfews. The uprising had ended not with victory, but with a heavy silence, a recognition that both peoples remained where they had always been, side by side, locked together, unable to part, unable to reconcile. In this atmosphere, Israel made a dramatic decision. In 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced that Israel would withdraw unilaterally from the Gaza Strip. Soldiers would leave their bases, settlers would be removed from their homes, and the territory would be handed over to Palestinian control. The move was startling, especially coming from Sharon, a man once known for his hardline. He argued that Israel could not hold Gaza indefinitely, that withdrawal would improve security and international standing. The process was wrenching. In the summer of 2005, Israeli soldiers entered settlements in Gaza not to defend them, but to evacuate them. Families wept as they packed belongings, refusing in some cases to leave voluntarily. Synagogues were dismantled, houses demolished, greenhouses sold or abandoned. Soldiers carried settlers from their homes, tears running down faces on both sides. For Israelis, it was a painful display of division, citizens against soldiers, ideology against pragmatism. For Palestinians, it was a moment of celebration. Crowds poured into the evacuated areas, raising flags and declaring victory. At last, after decades of occupation, Gaza was free of Israeli presence, at least in theory. Yet the withdrawal did not bring peace. Israel maintained control of Gaza's borders, airspace, and sea access. Goods and people moving in and out were still monitored, restricted, or blocked. The Strip, densely populated and already strained, struggled to function. Meanwhile, internal Palestinian politics took a dramatic turn. Since the 1990s, the Palestinian Authority, dominated by Fatah, had governed parts of the West Bank and Gaza. But another movement, Hamas, had grown stronger. Rooted in Islamic ideology and resistance, Hamas gained popularity through its social services, religious message, and opposition to negotiations that many Palestinians saw as fruitless. After the withdrawal, Hamas claimed credit, presenting itself as the force that had driven Israel out. Its popularity soared. In 2006, elections were held for the Palestinian Legislative Council. To the surprise of many, Hamas won a majority. The result shocked the world. Western governments, which had supported elections, suddenly faced the reality of a Hamas-led parliament. The United States, Europe, and Israel refused to recognize the government unless Hamas renounced violence and recognized Israel's right to exist. Hamas refused. The Palestinian Authority was thrown into crisis. The following year, 2007, saw a violent split. Clashes erupted between Hamas and Fatah forces in Gaza. For weeks, streets echoed with gunfire as rival factions fought for control. Families stayed indoors, terrified. By the summer, Hamas had seized power in Gaza, driving out Fatah officials. The Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas remained in control of the West Bank while Hamas governed Gaza. What had once been a single political movement fractured into two rival authorities. Palestinians, already divided by geography, were now divided by leadership. Life in Gaza under Hamas changed quickly. The group imposed stricter social rules, closed some institutions, and clashed with rival factions. Israel, declaring Hamas a terrorist organization, imposed a blockade. Goods were restricted, fuel limited, movement tightly controlled. Gaza became an enclave cut off from the world, its borders fenced, its economy suffocated. Fishing boats were confined to narrow zones, farmers restricted in their fields. Electricity shortages became common, with families enduring blackouts that lasted hours, sometimes days. For Israelis, the withdrawal brought little relief. Rockets began to be fired from Gaza into nearby towns like Sderot. The sound of sirens, the rush to shelters, and the fear of sudden explosions became part of daily life. Parents worried about sending children to school, counting the seconds to reach safety when alarms sounded. The dream that withdrawal might bring quiet was replaced by the reality of new forms of violence. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority maintained order with international support, but disillusionment grew. Settlements continued to expand, checkpoints multiplied, and the separation barrier wound deeper through the land. For Palestinians, the sight of more walls and more settlers eroded faith in negotiations. For Israelis, the barrier was defended as a shield, credited with reducing suicide bombings. The two perspectives remained locked in contradiction. Daily life in these years was shaped by the blockade, the barrier, and the divide. In Gaza, families cooked by candlelight during power cuts. Children studied by the glow of kerosene lamps. Fishermen returned with small catches, limited by patrol boats. Markets offered vegetables and bread, but shortages of fuel and medicine were constant. Weddings were still celebrated with dancing and songs, though often by generator light. Resilience remained, but hardship pressed harder. In the West Bank, life was a mixture of normalcy and restriction. Cafes in Ramallah filled with young people drinking coffee and talking politics. Universities bustled with students. Yet every journey between cities required passing through checkpoints, waiting in long lines, showing documents. Farmers tended olive groves under the watch of soldiers. Construction cranes rose in settlements nearby. The sense of being hemmed in, of a future narrowing, weighed heavily. In Israel, the years were marked by both progress and fear. The economy grew, technology advanced, and cities like Tel Aviv thrived with energy and culture. Yet the threat of rockets from Gaza, of attacks from the West Bank, and of regional hostility kept anxiety high. Families built bomb shelters, schools held drills, and security dominated politics. The divide between Gaza and the West Bank became more entrenched with time. For Palestinians, it was a painful split. Families separated by geography found it harder to travel. Politics grew bitter, with accusations and mistrust between Fatah and Hamas. Unity, once a dream, seemed distant. Refugees in camps across the Arab world watched with sorrow, seeing their people divided at the very moment they most needed unity. For Israelis, the division offered both relief and concern. Relief because the Palestinian side was weaker and less coordinated. Concern because negotiations were nearly impossible without a single partner to speak for all. The prospect of a two-state solution, once the language of hope, began to fade into uncertainty. And yet, through it all, daily life persisted. In Gaza, children flew kites above rooftops, their bright colors defying the grayness of blockade. In the West Bank, olive harvests continued, families gathering in groves to pick fruit as they had for centuries. In Israel, beaches filled with swimmers, Music played in cafes, and life thrived under the shadow of conflict. The withdrawal from Gaza and the political division that followed did not resolve the struggle. Instead, they deepened its complexity. Palestinians were split between two governments, one recognized abroad but weak at home, the other strong locally but isolated internationally. Israelis found themselves facing rockets from a land they no longer occupied directly, while still controlling its borders. The vision of peace grew dimmer, replaced by the reality of separation and division. The mid-2000s closed with more walls, more checkpoints, and more mistrust than before. The land remained what it had always been: ancient hills, crowded cities, fertile valleys, and seas that lapped at sandy shores. But its people carried heavier burdens, their lives shaped by politics, walls, and borders. The dream of peace seemed distant, yet the rhythms of life, planting, fishing, marrying, studying, praying, continued. The stage was set for more confrontation, for more cycles of violence and fragile ceasefires. And yet, beneath the weight of division, there remained the small, stubborn persistence of ordinary life, waiting for a future that might one day look different. Part 15. An Unfinished Story. The story of this land has never stood still. Borders have been drawn and redrawn, walls built and broken, ceasefires declared and shattered. For a century, people here have lived through partition, wars, uprisings, and fragile moments of peace. And yet, the conflict continues. Today, Gaza stands once more at the heart of a devastating war. Its people facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in living memory. The latest war began in October 2023 when a sudden attack by Hamas on southern Israel triggered a massive military response. Israeli forces struck Gaza with air, land, and sea power. Neighborhoods were flattened, families displaced, entire districts turned to rubble. The fighting deepened again in March 2025, when a ceasefire collapsed and Israel launched a surprise offensive. The weeks that followed brought more bombings, more funerals, and more despair. In Gaza City, a busy street market was hit in May, leaving families grieving for children, mothers, and elders killed while searching for food. What began as another war soon became something even more terrible: a famine. The blockade, destruction of farmland, and collapse of supply lines left more than 500,000 people in Gaza without food. In the north, conditions were declared famine by international experts, with warnings that hunger would spread to the center and south. Families searched for bread but found nothing. Water pumps ran dry, hospitals closed their doors, medicines disappeared. Parents held children whose arms had grown thin, their voices faint with hunger. Doctors treated patients with no supplies, sometimes forced to choose who might live and who could not. The death toll is staggering. Health authorities report more than 60,000 Palestinians killed, with thousands more missing beneath rubble. Many of the dead are women and children. More than half of Gaza's buildings lie damaged or destroyed. Schools and homes turned into piles of broken concrete. Refugee camps that once offered shelter are now overcrowded with those displaced yet again. Families who had already fled once in 1948 or again in 1967 now find themselves homeless for a third or fourth time. Daily life has been stripped to its most fragile essence. Parents stand in long lines at aid distribution points, only for those places to be struck by chaos or gunfire. People have been killed while waiting for flour. Their lives ended in the very act of seeking survival. Fishermen cannot sail beyond narrow zones. Farmers cannot reach their fields, and markets hold almost nothing. Families cook by candlelight during long blackouts. Children study in tents when schools collapse. And weddings are whispered celebrations of endurance rather than joy. In Israel, families live with their own fears. The attacks of 2023 killed civilians in towns and villages, shaking the sense of security to the core. The rocket fire from Gaza, though diminished, continues to send families rushing into shelters at night. For Israelis, this war is described as survival, a fight against a group that carried out massacres and kidnappings. For Palestinians, it is seen as another chapter of displacement and devastation, one that adds to the long line of catastrophes stretching back through their history. The world watches with alarm. Aid agencies plead for safe corridors. Convoys try to cross borders only to be blocked or delayed. Diplomats call for ceasefires that collapse almost as soon as they are announced. The United Nations warns of famine spreading like a shadow across the Strip. The images that emerged showed children searching through ruins, mothers weeping over shrouds, fathers digging with bare hands for survivors. And yet, even now, life does not stop completely. Families whisper bedtime stories in tents, trying to comfort children with tales of olive groves and seashells. Neighbors share what little food they find, passing bread from hand to hand. In Israel, families gather for holidays, lighting candles in memory of the missing and the dead. In Gaza, families pray beneath broken roofs, their voices carried upward into the night sky. This conflict has no true ending written yet. The pages are still being filled by loss and resilience, by hunger and survival, by fear and fragile hope. What is certain is that the story of this land is not over. Gaza, scarred and grieving, continues to endure. Israel, fearful and determined, continues to fight. And the world continues to ask whether there will ever be a day when both peoples can rest without fear, when the sound of children playing replaces the sound of drones, when the olive trees bear witness not to division, but to peace. This story remains unfinished. The war will end one day, though no one knows when. The famine will be answered, though too late for some. And the people of this land will continue to dream, because they must. Amid ruins, hunger, and grief, life goes on. And even in the darkest hour, the human heart still turns toward tomorrow. And so our journey comes to a pause. The story of Israel and Palestine remains unfinished, a tapestry woven with hope, sorrow, endurance, and dreams that reach beyond war and walls. The land itself endures, its olive groves still standing, its seas still whispering, its people still holding on to life. Thank you for listening and resting with this history tonight. If this story has carried you gently towards sleep, or if it has given you something new to reflect on, I invite you to support this channel. A simple like, a quiet subscription, or even sharing this with a friend helps keep these long histories alive. May your night be peaceful, may your rest be deep, and may we all imagine a future where stories of conflict give way to stories of peace. Until next time, good night.